Deathsmiles I and II are the 5th and 6th cave titles to make their way to Switch this year and are arguably the most well known of the bunch in the wider gaming world. Especially the first game, which is, let's be honest, the one we're all here for. And it's also the one I'm going to focus on for the vast majority of this review. There are two reasons for the larger than usual reach the game has. One is the gothic lolly anime stylings of the playable characters, and two is, in a genre more usually known for its ball-busting difficulty, the relative ease and accessibility of the gameplay. And whatever you or I may think of the first of those factors, it's the second one I feel that is the more significant and interesting to talk about, because make no mistake about it, when playing purely for survival, Deathsmiles can offer a comparatively gentle ride. I say can because, in an interesting departure from the norm, how difficult you want the game to be is, to a greater or lesser extent depending on the mode you're playing, left up to the player, with the ability to choose to tackle each of the first 6 stages at either difficulty level 1, 2 or 3. In arcade mode you can only play 2 stages on level 1 before that option is then removed, and then 2 more on level 2 before that's taken away too. But in the console modes you can play as many of the first 6 stages on level 1 as you wish, which should mean almost anyone can make it to the final stage on 1 credit, although I will say actually defeating the final boss will offer a sterner test, even to players arriving with a full life-stock. Your life-stock, by the way, gets depleted in 2 ways. Take a direct hit from an enemy bullet and you'll lose 1 whole life, but collide with an enemy itself or clip one of the larger enemy shots and you'll only lose half. If you take a direct hit when you have 1 life at a half position, you'll only be taken down to the next whole number, which is pretty generous really. In a further nod to self-determination, players can also approach the stages in different orders depending on their preferences through the use of a little world map. There are 6 initial stages arranged in 2 rows of 3. You must always choose 1 from the bottom row, then 1 from the top, and so on. But other than that, the order is left up to you. This is especially useful in arcade mode, since if you find a particular stage or boss tougher than the others, you can choose to deal with them on level 1, while leaving the ones you have a better handle on for when you're forced to jump to level 3. For instance, I find Sakura the swamp boss no problem on level 1, but very tough on level 3, so I always make sure to tackle that stage early-ish, with the reverse being true of the Port Town stage, which I still find manageable enough on level 3. And I say early-ish instead of first because there is an added consideration here, with life boosts being available in certain stages, but crucially only if being played on certain difficulty levels. For example, by choosing to take on the swamp stage at level 1, I would miss out on that stage's additional life pickup. Even further choice is given to players after completion of these initial 6 stages, as they're offered the option of either heading to the last stage, or taking on 1, or in Mega Black Label, 2 additional stages, which the more mathematically inclined among you will have already realised gives Deathsmiles 9 stages in total, making for a very hefty amount of content, especially when you consider the final stage is broken up into 3 very distinct sections, each one almost as long as a regular stage itself. And by the way, if you're just aiming to net a 1cc, I would strongly recommend giving the additional stages a skip, as they are significantly tougher than anything else in the rest of the game, including the final regular stage. So that's a lot of content available just straight up in terms of length, but with up to 5 playable characters, each of whom plays very differently, and 2 different endings for each character, this ought to offer a serious amount of playtime even to those not particularly concerned about going for the 1cc. The playable characters are all, as you're probably very well aware, young girls designed in the gothic lolly style. While to many this may be a bit cringeworthy, the awkwardness is mostly confined to promotional materials, and when actually playing the game, there's really nothing much to get your excessively frilly silk knickers in a twist over. Each girl is accompanied by a familiar such as an owl, bat or fairy, and these familiars are not just witchy props, but play a crucial role in how you play the game. Your familiar rotates around your character, acting both as a kind of offensive turret, but also with the defensive ability to block certain enemy shots, something that comes into play especially in version 1.1. However, even though each girl does play pretty differently, I do feel like Rosa is notably better than almost everyone else, and playing with her makes bosses in particular feel almost like they're 1 difficulty level lower than playing with anyone else. Your own shots follow the standard regular and focus method of many a cave game, but with a little twist that, even though this isn't the first place it was ever seen, is still arguably the game's most identifiable feature, namely the ability to direct your fire either left or right at will. The way this is implemented control-wise is simply using one button to fire left and one to fire right, and even though on a console and in the control setup, the option is there to assign left, right and turbo left, turbo right to 4 different buttons, personally I find it more convenient to go with the more arcade style tapping and holding down of just 2 buttons to keep things simple. Your focus or regular shot also affects your rotating familiar, as depending on which character you choose, the familiar will either rotate or lock in place according to your way of firing. There's also a lock-on style shot engaged by holding down both buttons at once, with the exact way that works again differing by character. And you also have a stock of bombs mapped to their own button, with more of these being somewhat hard to come by and therefore best to be kept and used smartly. You'll also, I'm sure, have already noticed the counter in the bottom left of the screen. This increases as you collect bonus items dropped by defeated enemies, and when it maxes out at 1000, pushing both shot buttons at once sees you enter a power mode, in which your shots become more powerful and bonus items become worth even more points. There's also a bullet cancelling effect immediately upon activation, and while mastering its intricacies is something mainly associated with score play, it is very useful for helping you out in terms of survival too, and it really pays to make the effort to learn how it works in a little more depth. Also, it's just pretty fun and interesting and will help you get a lot more out of the game, so let's take a look at how it works. The first thing to understand is that enemies drop 2 types of bonus items in normal mode, skulls and crowns. Skulls add +1 to your counter, crowns add +5. The first little wrinkle here is that when crowns hit the ground, they split into lower value skulls, so it's best to scoop them up in the air, which requires getting up close and personal with the enemies, adding of course a little bit of risk factor. The second wrinkle is that different enemies will drop higher value items depending what shot type you use on them, including the lock-on shot. Now, my first reaction on learning this was, well, I'm never going to remember that, it's probably just some technique for experts, but actually it is a lot more intuitive than it seems at first glance. Since lots of enemies come in waves or clusters of the same type, if you see low value skulls dropping, it's easy enough to just switch to an alternative fire to start generating the crowns before the formation even passes. Through doing this, you will also relatively quickly come to remember which shot is best suited to which enemy type, and making the right choice is a really important way to boost not just your score, but your chances of making it far in the game. Where things get really interesting is once you activate the power mode. Now you start getting points purely based on how many bonus items you pick up regardless of type. In other words, it's now better to let things hit the ground and split, as you'll have more to grab in terms of sheer volume. The counter takes a good while to tick down to 0, and the more bonus items you collect, the higher the score for each one, so you'll often find it's towards the end of one of these periods that your score really starts to go through the roof. Bombing during this mode massively increases the speed of the counter's reduction, but you can use this to good effect by making sure you time your exit from power mode just as you know there's about to be a big eruption of bonus items, thus allowing you to jump back into power mode all the more quickly. Timing this right is difficult, however, and you'll also want to keep in mind the time of activation to maximise score potential during power mode too, with an optimised activation sometimes giving you about 10 times the score of a poor one. It's a really superbly worked system, and while I know some people may say, oh, I don't play for score, in this case you may want to make the effort, as hitting the extends without making use of these techniques is unlikely to happen, whereas it doesn't take too much expertise to make sure you're picking up both. So as you can see, despite being billed as more casual friendly, there's a lot in Deathsmiles for more serious players to get their teeth sunk into, and the game does a brilliant job of making itself accessible to newer players, while simultaneously offering complexity and challenge to veterans. Visually, Deathsmiles is a real treat. As mentioned, if you're playing Mega Black Label, there can be as many as 9 different stages, and each is distinct, not just in appearance but also mechanically, with a lot of verticality in stages like the canyon or the volcano, which sees you descend into the fiery depths, and if playing on a higher level, dodging the upward eruptions of lava. These eruptions don't happen, however, if you play on difficulty level 1, and there are many such cases, especially with bosses who will frequently have extra phases depending on level selected. The graveyard boss, for example, which is a giant head, is able to be dispatched quickly and simply on level 1, but requires you to flay the flesh from his face and expose the skull beneath for the final phase on level 3. Yeah, there's a reason no one ever refers to this as a cute 'em up. Nowhere is the visual variety more apparent than in the final stage. This opens with you flying about the turreted exterior of a castle before descending to a boss fight with Mary the cow, entering the castle's hallways and descending then reascending its main staircases and ramparts before finally arriving in a stately ballroom where finely dressed ladies and gentlemen waltz between the club-waving ogres and fang-bearing wolves snarling from the balconies. I would say it's one of my favourite stages in any shmup, and whatever you may think of the gothic lolly character designs, the stage backgrounds and enemies are some of the best you'll ever see. The music may not be the absolutely most memorable Cave has ever done, but it still does a great job of mixing up faster, rockier elements with gothic organs, etc., and it's very fitting for the atmosphere of the game. Sound effects are mostly all good. I did find a couple of the shot noises for the familiars to be a little irritating at first, but it's nothing you won't get over quickly enough. Now, in terms of the port and the versions available, what we're looking at here is, I believe, very similar to what was found on the 360 release. There's Arcade 1.1 and Normal for the main game, with Normal offering spruced up visuals, and 1.1 allowing you more control over your familiar, and upping the bullet count to both terrify casuals and offer higher scoring potential for experts. You then have the same three options for Mega Black Label, which, while it does mix things up, most notably by offering a level 999 difficulty, allowing you to enter power mode with the counter as low as 500, and of course that additional stage mentioned earlier, isn't the same sort of massive mechanical overhaul we've seen in other titles, like the addition of Ikaruga style red and blue bullets in Escalada 2 or Ketsuipachi in DFK. The external options provided are mostly solid enough, but there are a couple of odd little missteps here. The first is in regards to screen size. While the Switch version doesn't suffer from the same large borders issue of the PS4 edition, some modes do still leave a sliver of space around the edge of the screen. This is all the more inexplicable because the issue is not present in other modes. The way that online operates is not particularly intuitive either, and given how few scores there are on the leaderboards, I'm guessing I'm not alone in thinking so. Scores on Switch also have XXX for their final three numbers for some reason, something not that important when you're scoring in the tens and hundreds of millions, but odd all the same. Still, at least there is online, and it does do its job once you're used to it. There's also a training mode which, while it does provide a lot of good options, is missing the ability to practice boss fights without playing through a whole stage. This is particularly an issue when it comes to the final boss fight, which is, as you'd expect, far and away the most difficult part of the game and the part requiring the most practice, but it's also at the end of the lengthiest stage, making it something of an annoyance to practice. In terms of performance, things felt, to me, pretty fine. There were worries about input lag given City Connection's recent track record with Cotton 2, but this always felt like it was having a bit more effort put into it. It's not up to M2 levels maybe, but although sensitive players may pick up on a very little sluggishness in handheld mode, I found things felt responsive enough to not present any issues when playing with a stick on the TV. Now there is of course one further thing to talk about with this release, and that is Deathsmiles II. I actually think if I get the time I'll try to give the sequel its own review because it really is a quite different game. Suffice it to say though, I am not its biggest fan. It's not terrible to play by any stretch, but it is ugly as sin, and as far as I'm concerned, it's something of a blot on Cave's otherwise pristine copybook. Its inclusion here, however, obviously does absolutely nothing to detract from the package overall, and while I knew from playing the first Deathsmiles in the arcade that it was a great game in its own right, I'm both delighted and relieved that this Switch release has been solidly ported, making a very easy recommend, and I'm happy to give this a 9 out of 10, with it being a great choice for players of pretty much every skill level and offering a wealth of content across its pair of games. As mentioned at the start, this is one of the most popular and well-known shmups around, so I imagine a lot of you will have played it already, If so, do let us know your thoughts below, and thanks as ever for watching. See you next time. Cheers.